Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Pull up the audience online for a moment. Looks like we got several people online with us tonight. So this is our last class. And so the people that are on Zoom, you were sent an email that has the post test in it and an explanation of how to send it back and easily just send me the answers and that will be fine. And everybody here, pretty much wait until the end if you can, and then give me the post test back at the end. And then another reminder is kind of save the date for December 12th, because that will be our Christmas banquet and recognition banquet type thing. We have a big deal. It's at the Civic Hall, be at 6 o'clock, but you'll be getting news about that. And I'm sorry if I confused you all again with the class reminder and the meeting reminder. It was a duplicate. You all do not have to start doing your hours until January. That part of the memo was for certified master gardeners or those that wanted to be recertified. So, okay. So I think, yes. Yes, this Thursday, 6 o'clock is the Master Gardener Association meeting and you all are invited. They do a potluck. Yes, it's here. 6 o'clock, we do meet and greet. 6:30, we eat, and then 7, they start going into the business meeting. And then we do have a presenter, which is Stephen Smith. And he taught for us, he taught botany at the beginning of our classes. So he will be talking about seed saving at the meeting. So if you
Stephen is one of the graduates of our program too.
yeah, he's got his doctorate. Yeah, young, much younger than me.
He's got a book.
He's got a book. He's got a doctorate. Okay,
Lots of seeds.
and lots of seeds. All right, so I think we're ready to get started. And we have Dr. Donald Sudbrink from Austin Peay State University, and we're glad to have him here with us again tonight to talk about plant diseases. And so, Donald, thank you for being here, and I'll let you give any other information that you want. I'm going to turn this.
No problem. You just call me Don. I'm a bug doctor and a plant pathology person. So like my first degree was entomology and plant pathology from the University of Delaware, like fighting blue hens. My master's was from UT in entomology and plant pathology. Then I got my PhD at Auburn in entomology. But I've always had an affinity for plants and plant disease and or knowledge of how to help manage those things. And so I gave the first lecture earlier in September on entomology and insects and pests. I'm going to continue in that vein on this other very important set of organisms that cause these problems, or set of organisms and some conditions. We'll talk about that. So what I'd like to try to do is to kind of have a first half and a second half of this, because I'm going to be continuing some using some lectures from some of my professors who were were extension agents at the University of Tennessee some years back, Steve Bost and Alan Wyndham. And so we're going to talk, those great plant pathologists. And so I've kind of adapted and modified it. One brief thing though, I want to talk about Austin Peay Agriculture Department. So we have a full-scale agriculture department with a variety of different coursework. I'm the one that teaches a lot of the plants courses and plant disease courses or others like that. So plant pathology is one that I do every other spring. Agriculture 4440. Economic entomology, I'm going to do that next fall as well. And then weed science, I'm doing that this fall, how to work with weed problems. Fruit and vegetable crops, I think that'll be offered spring of 26. And then I'm going to do tobacco and grain crops in the spring. So I've got a lot of familiarity with cropping agriculture. And then forestry, I do every spring as well. So variety of different things they have me doing, a lot of hats I'm wearing. If anybody has any questions or things like that, that's my email up there, sudbrinkd@apsu.edu. All right. Let's see. So this is adapted from a lecture series for master gardeners that Steve Bost and Alan Wyndham did. And so I've kind of modified it. And some of the things that we have to consider with plant diseases are they have major impacts on crops. They've had major impacts in the past. They will continue to have troubles and things pop up, just like Carla was telling me, these strawberries, there's recently been this major new infection of those. So we'll talk about a lot of those things. But one of the most important reasons we're talking about them is because they reduce
the supply of food, fiber, and timber. They're major detractors of those things, and partially because that's what a lot of those organisms do. They're feeding on these plants. They can detract from beauty and property value and cost of control, cost of replanting, increasing those problems, price increases for consumers and things. And this is the strawberry situation we've got. All of the transplants now, many of these have been affected with this fungus that is a similarity to botrytis, but is a new one that we'll talk about. Yeah, and so really problematic with this local industry that we have here. So we're going to talk about a series of different things. We're going to get some basics of plant pathology kind of first. Then we'll talk about examples of diseases from each of these major pathogen groups. We're going to talk about pathogenic disease predominantly. Sometimes they talk about things like nutrient deficiencies as a disease, but many times they're more syndromes and things like that. They're lack of something or some other, but it's the active organisms, the viruses, the bacteria, the fungi, and nematodes that are causing problems with plants that we're really focused on here. And then we'll talk about some examples of disorders and a little bit about the art of plant diagnosis at the end, just to keep in mind, there's so much that's involved with plant disease, and it's not really possible to know everything immediately. So you can rest assured that you don't have to know all of it, but we can narrow down to what kinds of things might be impacting different crops and different plants. All right, so what is plant disease? Typically, plant pathologists consider any abnormal condition to be disease or disease-like. I'll say that. It's difficult for most people to picture abnormalities such as frost damage or insect damage as disease because it's something different. So truthfully, we're going to focus on the causal organisms that are dealing with that. But I'll go over a few other things prior to that. The key split here is diseases are only one of many types of plant problems, but abiotic problems are those that are not organismal caused or viral caused. So non-living agents, damage from all sorts of things. Could be chemicals. Sometimes in recent years, there's been a lot of spray drift from certain types of herbicides that have traveled on the wind to other places and damaged plants. That's one thing. That's not necessarily a disease. That's an actual, a chemical problem. Others are weather related. We've seen many of those over the last many years here, problematic with all kinds of our vegetation around here. And mechanical damage. See, what do they call that one? Weed whacker blight on the trees and stuff like that. That can be a problem, but that's not a disease. And nutritional problems. So there's many different things with plants that's sometimes really hard to figure out. What is happening to this plant? Why is it turning yellow? Or why is it, what is the causal problem of this? Sometimes it may be not enough nutrients. The plant doesn't have. But those are all what we call abiotic conditions. That's an important thing. I think that's probably on your testing materials and all that stuff. Abiotic versus biotic disease problems. So biotic being biologically based. Damage caused by organisms, often microscopic stuff. You can't see the causal agents because they're so tiny, but you can see their symptoms. Sometimes you can see their signs, but mostly they're pretty small. And there's this thing that they talk about in plant pathology. It's not a good relationship. It's a parasitic relationship. If they're parasitizing plants, if they set up a sustained relationship of the organism feeding on or taking over parts of the plant. That place. So there, and also diseases, and sometimes pest species are vectors of this, like insect species. I talked about aphids the last time, and some of the sucking bugs, like the white flies and others, that can vector diseases to plants, are problems. And they can also feed and take the juice out of the plants. They can really cause wilting and other things like that. So abiotic and biotic, those are some important key separators to make sure that you're knowing. And sometimes it's not easy to tell when you're out in the field what's going on, but many times we can separate things that way and what sort of effect they're going to have.
Something new.
And so passing the test to be called a plant disease, there's 3 requirements: some plant damage involved with it, caused by an organism, that's to delineate that from disorders, and this sustained relationship. Not just an insect kind of feeding a little here, going to the next one, feeding a little there. This is a sustained thing where whatever that is, a fungus or bacteria is kind of working into that plant and feeding, kind of making a food relationship off of that plant. And there's several definitions to kind of consider. I've said the word parasitism before, so we may want to talk about that. So a parasite, an organism that obtains its nutrients from another organism. It's a very broad definition. And there's many of these organisms that fit that category. Then there's this term pathogen. So plant pathology, a pathogen. We have pathogens that affect us. Then the plants have pathogens that affect them. So these are parasites that cause plant disease by disturbing the normal metabolic processes of the plant, shutting down one form or other, or slowing it down, or draining the batteries of it, or something like that. You know, that's what these things are doing. So those are some basic. And then saprophyte is an organism that lives off of dead matter. Sapros, from the Greek, are related to those that feed off of dead organic matter. Some of these organisms are mostly feeding on a bunch of decayed organic matter. Then they'll lash out and feed on some little baby plant that's been growing. Stuff like that, like water molds do that. They can live as saprophytes for part of their life cycle and then become pathogens at other times. And we see that in all sorts of different places. So parasite, pathogen, and saprophyte, those are terminologies that you may see when we're talking about plant diseases. It's important, though, to take a step back and talk about some of the abiotic considerations first. So diseases versus disorders and things like that. And so when we talk about disorders, there's a lot of different things that may be causing problems with plants that look perhaps like even a causal organism disease, but any kind of injury not caused by organisms. So pH, if you've got pH that's either too alkaline or too acidic, that can cause problems for certain plants. If it's too acid, like many of the soils around here, it can take some of the nutrients and lock them up to the soil particles. You all had the soils part, right? When that happens, and if the pH is too low, they can't release them. So plants have a hard time getting nutrients. And we'll see that in certain parts of fields, like you might see a lot of broom sedge growing in a pasture when it's low pH. But then some plants really like to have low pH, like blueberries. They got to have lower pH in order to grow well. So pH is a very important thing. Water, having too much or too little, it's always the question, always a problem. And so much of this summer we spent with the too little variety of it, for sure. And then recently we've just gotten a few rains, but that's, obviously different. If too much water is ponding in a place, it can basically suffocate the plants. They can't get. Oh, yes. Question? Is there a question? Okay, sorry. Okay, so, but so sometimes that can be a problem with the water. With too much water, you can have the plants can actually drown if they're in it for too long. Temperatures, of course, too high and too low. We run into those extremes. These are not diseases, but disorders. Fertilizer burn. Too much hot fertilizer on a plant, little baby plants can really scorch them. Pesticides, obviously, if it's an herbicide, that can be a real problem. I'm going to pass around a specimen that has injury as a result of 2,4-D herbicide. So I'm going to pass it around. You can see it distorts and causes the plant to grow in a kind of strange twisted shape called epinasty. Pass that. Oh, 2,4-D is a type of herbicide that kills broadleaf plants that they use in various agricultural applications. Will kill broadleaf plants, but not grasses so much. But yeah, it's one that is still registered with EPA and used, but that's kind of a disorder, is more what that would be considered, not a disease from that. Because someone sprayed it and it spread. We have some other cases of things like that have happened. Is there a question? Oh, okay, I got you. Okay, I got you. Yeah, okay. So then one other thing that really shows up more when folks are thinking it's a disease and it might be a nutritional disorder. There's not enough nitrogen in the soil or not enough potassium or phosphorus or other types of things. So that can cause significant discoloration of the leaves, stunting of the plants and things like that. Again, not a disease, but a disorder. And so air pollution can be a problem as well.
So if you've got a lot of, we have some, we'll check on the speaker here. Air pollution can be a problem as well. If you've got.
Somebody needs to turn their microphone off. Like, I don't know what's going
Somebody
on.
needs
Someone's
to
just
turn their
moaning in the
microphone off.
camera.
Yeah, Nashville has these events, these bad air days. You ever see that on the news? What happens is in that Nashville basin, you have ozone or other types of things that will be in high amounts, and that can be problems for plants as well as our lungs, and things like that. So air pollution and mechanical injury, like I mentioned. So, if I'm driving a tractor or something like that over tree roots, that's going to be mechanical damage as opposed to other things. Or lightning strikes. That's natural phenomenon. Sorry, okay, no problem. So anyway, so disorders is the key, is that they're not technically classed as pathogenic diseases, but they're going to be something that you encounter, and not always easy to tease apart. Sometimes a stunted plant may be from nematode roundworms feeding on the roots and making it look like it's a nutrient deficiency. Okay, so now I still seem to be able to move this along though. You took away my ability to move the slides. Or something like that. Let's see, do I have to click on it or do you just have the magic touch?
I don't know. What do we?
There we go. Okay. One thing that you will probably see on some kind of evaluation or test or something like that is this very critical concept of the plant disease triangle. Anybody ever heard of this before? Okay, good. So basically what this is, biotic plant diseases, those that are living organisms or viruses, require the interaction of susceptible hosts, of hosts that can be invaded, like the strawberries over there in that case, a virulent pathogen, like that fungus, and the right favorable environmental conditions. So all that's got to be there. Fungi love lots of water, so do bacteria. Those can be problems. You get all those three present, and the disease can occur and continue until one of them is intercepted. So you could do something about the susceptibility of the host, or attack the pathogen, or change the environment if you got a greenhouse or something like that to alter that. But that's a dynamic process. Virulent, susceptible host attacked by a virulent pathogen under the right environmental conditions. All that stuff kind of has to come together. So anyway, plant disease triangle, you'll probably see something like that in your studies in that process. Another thing you're going to learn about is the actual organism. These biotic organisms are numerous, and there's so many, but the major groups that we're going to talk about are fungi in particular. We think about animals, livestock, pets. They're mostly, we think about bacteria or viruses that are diseases of them. There are some fungals, but they're not as advanced. But with the plant world, that's the place that the fungi decide they really love a lot. And so in many cases, it's a lot of different species of fungi that they're going to be attacking in plants. They're really successful at that. Certain fungi. Then the bacterium are, of course, much smaller organisms. And there is a series of bacteria that are problems with plant diseases. We don't quite have them on the same scale as the fungi in plant pathology, but there still can be some significant impacts with bacteria. And then viruses, those incredibly tiny particles that aren't technically living, but they have the DNA or RNA to take over the cell's DNA structures and keep replicating copies of themselves to the point of preventing them from producing chlorophyll or other things like that, or shutting them down entirely and just producing, lots and lots of copies of themselves. That's the virus. So if you're looking at this image up here, fungal cells this is a plant cell, this is a big green structure there. And this is what fungal cells might look, typical fungal cells might look as they're invading into that cell. So again, this is all under the microscope because you can't really see the plant cells. Bacteria are much smaller. You can see some of them have mobile structures and things like that. And the viruses are much even smaller than that, to the point where you need sometimes electron microscopes to see those. Then there's this animal that attacks them that is still microscopic, but we still consider it as part of plant pathology with plant pathogens. This is the head of a nematode that has this piercing, sucking style that drinks the plant juice or juices, similar to the way aphids and other things would, but much smaller, nearly microscopic. Things that are
smaller than an eyelash, and even, that are difficult to see sometimes. Many nematodes that are problems with that are small. So those are the 4 major groups of the biotic agents that are causing it. We're going to talk about some of these symptoms, and I'll start with the fungi because they're some of the most problematic, and then talk about each of those as we go along. So any questions about any of that? All right, so diseases themselves, we're going to talk about the diseases and their symptoms, at least some of them. One thing to know is you don't have to know every disease, but it is useful to know what plant species you've got, because many times that can determine what diseases might be occurring. So that's many times like it's situational in those cases, because it's not one thing that attacks one species may not necessarily attack others. There's a lot of different things you can see on this image: fruit rots and blights, and cankers, galls, knots in the roots, leaf spots, powdery mildew, wilts, all kinds of different things like that. Some of these have some very old English word roots to them that are because they've been a problem with agriculture for a very long time. Another one is called smut, which is one that attacks corn and things like that. And it's this kind of dark fungus, but that was the term that was used for it, and that was applied to other things later. But so as far as that goes, so now diseases and their symptoms, though, there's a lot of things. Now, it is important in history. It's been important in history. One of those particularly problematic organisms is a water mold called Phytophthora infestans, or potato lake blight. This was responsible for the great famines that hit Ireland in the 1840s that destroyed the vast majority of their very important food crops, causing starvation, exacerbating a problem of tenant-landlord system that the English had over the Irish that forced people who couldn't produce food off of their lands to die in the gullies and alleys, things like that. But it all was caused by one really important crop that was the only thing everybody could grow in that place, and which was just destroyed by this water mold. This is still a problem in potato fields, in different parts of the world. And so we have to deal with it. Fortunately, we have many different techniques to do that now. Other infamous diseases included the great chestnut blight. This was a disease that wiped out one of the greatest tree species in Eastern North America. All up and down the the Appalachians, Atlantic seaboard, you had this tree that's a human up there next to those trees. They were massive. Parts of the Smokies and all the parts of Appalachians. We had them over here to this part of Montgomery County. We were on the edge of that. But when this disease came through in the teens, I think it swept through from the Northeast and wiped all the way down and destroyed all of the active growing chestnut trees from above the ground. However, fortunately, there were some that were able to sprout from roots. So we still have seeds and they're trying to grow them back. But this was devastating. We used to have the oak and chestnut forests, and now it's called the oak hickory forests, things like that, to wipe them out. Yeah.
I read today that Petco company, seed company out of Maine, has some of their profits go to the chestnut organization to keep the trees going.
Yes, the American Chestnut Foundation is a very active organization that's been working on crossbreeding these chestnut trees there's an Asian chestnut tree that isn't affected by it and isn't affected by it as badly. If they cross that and back cross it to a 15/16 American, it has the 92 or some % of the American genome, but the protective genome of the Asian variant, and it still produces chestnuts. So they're trying to grow those in orchards to bring some of this species back. Yes. Yes, there is an apparent causal event, which was someone brought an infected tree stock to the Brooklyn Botanical Garden, and that spread. Now that's probably the central locus, but there may have been others that were brought in. But the key is they were infected, and Asian chestnuts aren't impacted by the disease nearly as badly, but American chestnuts had no protection. And so they were just wiped out. So you could see this cankerous-like growth you know, here above ground, all this stuff was infected. Below, down in the root structures, it wasn't infected, but everything above that part died. So it was a mass die out. By the 50s, all those chestnuts were pretty much, those massive towering chestnuts were done. People salvaged what they could. You know, it's not a lot different in approach from what happened to some of these ash trees with the emerald ash borer and the infestation that's occurred, this massive change that just started in 2002 in the port of Detroit. That was in wood shipping dunnage when those insects got out. And by the time they were out, it was too late. There was just no way to control all of those without just, you know, laying, you know, something almost to the kin of nuclear. But anyway, but the thing is, this was, you know, this chestnut blight was really bad. So I can go on. I gotta move it along. There's another one called Dutch elm disease that was similar, but it was, the causal situation was Ceratocystis almii, Asian fungus was identified. And the problem was, set a 1-2 punch. Little tiny insect the size of a pencil with it, carries the fungus with it and goes in and starts feeding. The fungus then spreads and kills the tree. Again, girdling the tree, killing everything above it. Graceful elm trees were all over parts of America and the American elm. And mostly it just wiped them out. 40 million trees killed, you know, et cetera, the kind of just devastating damage. There's still a big American elm on Austin Peay's campus out next to the Red Barn. It's a big one. And somehow or other, it survived because it survived the onslaught and it wasn't impacted by it. And it's too far away and the insects that spread it aren't around. So chestnut blight continues to be active in parts of the Appalachians. I was up in East Tennessee a little while ago and you could see cankerous growths above ground, but other shoots coming up out of the ground. But American elms they've been doing some crossbreeding and things like that for them. So anyway, all right, that's the nightmare on Elm Street. Oh yeah. Yeah, okay. Mhm.
Okay. One is talking about this reach the end of his life. It's kind of sad, it's starting to split. But there's a baby, smaller one that's still there.
Yeah.
And the story goes, my grandfather, EO, basically fed these things intravenously when they were little. Got things from the co-op out there across the river and nursed those things. And what happened?
Yeah, there are injectors that you can purchase. It is not cheap. And it's not possible to save a whole forest, but you can save some of the trees. Yeah, that's it. Fortunately for things like emerald ash borer, there are soil drenches that you can do for systemic insecticide to kill the insect. And some of these others, you know, it's an injection process that takes it. On the campus of the University of Delaware, where I did my undergraduate, there's this long line of graceful elms on that, but they used to come by with helicopters and spray them each year. It was time for the beetles. It was usually sometime around spring break or something. And then someone said they couldn't do that on campus, and then one by one those trees started flagging and dying. So it took extra care to make sure that happened. Anyway, so these are just some impacts of what diseases can do. I'm not going to spend too much on it, but I am going to talk. Those are fungal or fungal-like the water molds for potato family. Fungi, that is this kingdom of organisms that is as complex as plants and as complex as animals, was probably more closely related to animals genetically than it is to plants. Because they don't make their own food, they actually, instead of ingesting it, they absorb it, put their little tendrils in, their hyphae and absorb all the energy from things. Fungi have so many different forms because it's a kingdom, if you think of all the animals, then that's the way you think about all the fungi. So many different types. Even though mostly we think of mushrooms, there's so many different things that are growing on and in and underground, things like that. They require an external food source, and typically they're called molds or rusts or rots. That's what we usually think of when we're talking about fungi. They have got this stuff called mycelia, which are these kind of mats of fine, feathery, hair-like cell structures that are really good at growing into places and absorbing energy from whatever it is, whether it's dead organic matter, whether it's plant matter, living plants, biotrophs feeding directly on plants. That's one of the problems. This is a mycelium of Rhizoctonia, one of the world's most common soil-borne pathogens. And so see this kind of fine fuzzy stuff that you've probably seen when you have fuzzy stuff thrown on any type of thing. It's because they're nearly microscopic, but you get enough of them together, you can see, at least the evidence of it, the signs of it. And so there's all kinds of bizarre structures that you might see erupting out of a plant in some place or another. Pycnidia and cinema and other kinds of things like that were structures where they don't have to go through, some of these have to go through full sexual reproduction. They can do asexual reproduction with spores and crank out, a scientific term, bazillions of spores, just so many spores, that they just kind of, at a certain point, they'll start growing little sections and then just sending them off in the air. And we get those. This is about the time of year we'll start to get the mold issues with allergies and stuff like that, because we get rainfall, you get a lot of fungal spores and things like that. They're very effective. Sometimes they can find fungal spores up in the upper atmosphere, drifting on currents. And so they can even be intercontinental in their travels. They're so light and tiny, and many of them don't make it. There's lots of them produced, but the ones that do will take over, and some of them will hit our plants. You can actually see some components of these. So the fruiting bodies of fungi will sometimes erupt off of a plant, like these fruiting bodies on a black rod of grape. You can see these kind of specks that are kind of swollen. You can see that there's a three-dimensionality to them on the surface of that. And that's where then they're going to eventually poof out a bunch of spores and then spread themselves to the next place. Here are some spores of botrytis on strawberry. And Carla was talking about how this new fungus looks something like botrytis, this gray mold that occurs on them. And you can see that one strawberry on the one side is a healthy strawberry. The other is in kind of the full stages of infection, and the last one is going to be end stages of infection. These fungal organisms will grow in there and just obtain all that energy and grow and reproduce and grow and reproduce and spread to the point where it's just like this mummy left over of the structures, and it's all fungi. And then every one of those can produce a bunch of spores off of it and spread. We get these sometimes, you might find them off of produce in grocery stores. Things like it's always a battle in produce stocking to make sure that you've got, you're going to keep one step ahead of these things. I remember stocking shelves, and you have to turn that produce around, otherwise they would go rot. Others will produce this fine powdery mildew on the surface of plants. Anybody ever seen this, like on pumpkins and other vegetation, or this is like on crepe myrtle? There's a series of fungal hyphae and things like that will grow in mycelial mats across it, and they produce reproductive structures that are sexual reproductive structures. Makes it sometimes hard to stop some of those diseases. Powdery mildew. Question? Yeah.
What? I have zinnias.
Yeah.
Zinnias, but nothing else.
Goes back to that plant disease triangle. They're susceptible to this disease, and the pathogen is virulent enough, the environmental conditions are right. Other plants, they haven't been able to pick the lock of. They have enough resistance to it. Or some of them are just focusing on a certain family of plants or certain families of plants versus others. It's hard to answer that question easily because there's so many different situations with plants, but there's certain ones that really will hit the zinnias or the squash and things like that. They're just all over it, or they're even over on some of these ornamental plants. Powdery mildew is a particularly problematic one, and we usually see it later in the season. It comes to be a problem. Although, yeah, this year we had a few earlier problems of it too. So that's a mildew. And then there's another type of mildew that's called a downy mildew. So powdery mildew and downy mildew are different things. Powdery is more like its name. It's kind of this powdery white stuff on the surface. Downy mildew is a little grayer and typically produce these tufts on the underside of the leaf, where they kind of erupt down below. So this is on cucurbits. So any things like cucumbers, melon, squash, butternut leaf squash on this one. Downy mildews usually can't be seen with a naked eye, and they require magnification. But these are actually visible. That's the actual visible structures on the powdery mildew. So those are called signs. So mildew is a name that was commonly applied by farmers back in the old days, and it includes a bunch of things. They're not the same organism, the powdery mildew and the downy mildew. And then others are really easy to see. When we had the first rains that we hadn't had rains in a while, all of a sudden a bunch of these fungi started springing up in turf grass. And you're like, why in the heck does it circle? Anybody know what that might have been caused by? Say it again. Oh, oh yeah. Well, so typically when you have something like this, you had something that started out at a central location, an infection, that eventually year after year, it kind of expanded in the soil. And then whenever it's ready to reproduce, it pops up these fungi. This is stuff underground most of the time, most of the year, feeding on plant roots or organic matter, things like that. And so the first year may have been like this. The next year may have been a little wider and they popped up the little mushrooms. This is only done when they're ready to reproduce. So it's called fairy ring of turf grass, and you may see that at certain times of the year. Usually I see it kind of Bermuda grass, a little later in the season when you get a little bit of rain, stuff like that. But and so they're just reproducing with those fungal mushrooms that are up from the ground. And there's kind of what that looks like there. There's other fungi. So I talked about smut. That's what corn smut looks like, the head smut of an ear of corn. So when corn is silking, it's basically waiting for that pollen to come down from the tassels and pollinate it and make a corn kernel. But in this case, what happens is fungal spores will infest the silks and basically, go down there and produce in that rich, fertile source and produce these strange mushroom-like things. But it's a delicacy where corn was originated in Mexico. Itlacoche is the name of it. And it's something you can purchase. I've been able to go down to Nolensville Pike, and there's all those great international restaurant or grocery stores, and you can purchase it. It's not cheap, but it's you can make fritters out of it too. Other fungi you don't necessarily want to do if you don't know that, but corn smut is apparently edible, although I've had it as fritters before, kind of fried up, but it's something that's possible. Those are easy to see, typical fungal things. Sometimes they call them corn mushrooms. Also very similar. Anybody ever see these things? These Ganoderma conchs? Again, these are shelf fungi that are feeding on dead or dying trees, things like that, depending on the species, but they're obviously very visible. We always think fungi as mushrooms, but many of these plant pathogens don't really produce mushroom-like structures. And again, some are easy to see if you have got, rusts on plants. Let's see, I've been talking about a lot of this stuff. I'm going to pass a couple of rusts around. One of them is a wheat stem rust, and the other is a thing called cedar apple rust. We get that around here a lot when we have towns like named Cedar Hill, and you have apple tree production. They produce these organisms on the cedar tree, and we're feeding on that. Then they'll spread to them later in the season to apples. I'm going to pass these around. So you look at some rust. Rust have their name because certain stages are kind of rusty colored spores and lots of what they call Uridinea spores, but they can kind of leave some stains on it. The wheat stem rust is one of the world's potential problems for our food source. There was one that was recently came out called UG99 about 10 years ago, and it was causing serious depletion of world wheat crops, sometimes 100% destruction. Fortunately, they got resistant varieties to combat it. But anyway, rusts are another one. They're kind of bronzish colors, reddish colored spores, and they can be in lots of different types of plants. They're multi-stage fungi. So they're going in one stage, they're infesting the cedar trees. The next stage, they're going to go over and feed on apple leaves and transform themselves again. Multiple stages. They're very complex life cycles. Here's what the cedar apple rust looks like. It starts out with these kind of nodules that look on the tree. You may see that. And then later in the spring, they'll put out these weird orange tentacles. It looks like an alien invasion or something. And then that's going to be spewing a bunch of spores out. Later on, apple trees that get that on them get infected by that fungus as it transforms itself. So one of those is cedar apple rust. It's not a very impressive one like these rather large galls, and certainly not like this one. Usually this has to have all the right environmental conditions under cedar tree for that. And it's, it's kind of weird, but we get some of those every year in the springtime around here. So that's true fungi. There's other things that we think are fungi or maybe related to it, but they're really not. So sometimes there's a thing called slime mold that will grow on mulch. You ever seen mulch? And it's this thing that starts to grow and settle. It's a very different type of organism. It's an organism that has a unified structure that also spreads itself out and then can bring itself back to reproduce. It's really weird. It's kind of in between what different types of life are. It's not plant, it's fungal, it's not animal, but it's its own thing. So slime mold, and people have taken to call it dog vomit. I don't know what, but it kind of looks a little like it. But anyway, but that's not necessarily damaging the tree, but it's feeding on organisms that may be feeding on the compost. There's other slime molds on fescue. They're not necessarily causal agents of the plant, but you may see them. And then lichens and other things like that are issues sometimes. At certain times of year, you get a bunch of those on trees. Mostly they're not destroying the tree. They're just kind of, they might make it unsightly or something like that.
Good air quality.
I don't know. I've seen lichens in a lot of places. It means there's some moisture there somewhere. And many times it reminds me of something that's been around for a while too. But I don't know the full answer to that question. I don't know if I can give you I know that answer itself. But anyway, that's where a fungus lichen bacteria combination is part of that process that allows them to grow and survive. It's a mutualism. Anyway, not so much diseases, but they can become problems, if you're talking about ornamental quality and stuff like that. So then other times we see all kinds of stuff on plants. These are different fungal things, sooty blotch and fly speck, that are fungal infections of apples. And this is not technically damaging the apple, even though it looks awful. But this is hard to market. This one might be turned to applesauce or something like that. But it's not killing the plant, but it's definitely hard to market. And who wants to go buy that? So might peel the apple off to get the stuff inside. But that's the cosmetic disease can be a factor, in commercial production. All right. So there's some other issues with fungi where they're causing real symptoms that you can see that many times this is a good diagnostic. So chlorosis. Chlorosis means this yellowing the leaves. And I'm sure each of us I've seen a bunch of yellowing on plants, house plants that we're trying to grow. But that's, in certain cases, that may be from too much water or something like this, or lack of nutrients. So nutritional problems, but fungi can also cause this chlorosis, this yellowing of these leaves. Different fungi depending upon the species. So poorly drained sites can also indicate nutrient deficiency, but some of it is fungally caused. Hard to tell sometimes, in certain situations. So chlorosis is yellowing. Necrosis is dead tissues. Necrosis. From Greek nekros. Leaf spots or localized areas in necrotic tissues often accompanied by chlorosis. So you'll usually have yellowing and then necrosis of the leaves. And so we may see many of those black spot roses or early blight of tomatoes or alternaria leaf spots, things like that. That's many times just dead tissue at a certain point. Sometimes the plant is going to wall that part off, and so the rest of it can stay green. Other times it's going to, it'll spread. But those are terminologies that you'll see. Chlorosis and necrosis. Some of the lesions are leaf spots. Now, this one is a different kind of leaf spot. Common leaf spot on maybe alfalfa, clover. Leaf spot, like fungi can produce a bunch of different spotting on leaves. Sometimes it's very large, sometimes it's small, depending upon it. This is a spotting anthracnose on dogwood that has these kind of strange little structures. And then this leaf spot on photina is kind of more rounded. And eventually they can produce shot holes because the plant basically gives up that tissue so it can save the rest of its tissue. And some of them are angular blotches, downy mildew in cucumbers and pumpkins, depending upon the species. Others are, just strange forms. This is on dogwood again, the discula fungus. I've seen some anthracnose on English ivy and things like that. Late blight on tomato is not technically a fungus. It's a little bit different, but it's causing some similar kind of uh, misshapen leaf spots on them. And there's late blight and early blight, different concentric rings. So basically the fungus will start in one place and kind of grow, and the plant will try to shut it off and it will grow some more. You'll see it growing in sort of ring-like pattern. Okay, so those are some of the symptomatologies. Then there's, of course, chlorosis, necrosis, dead tissues, the leaf spots, and then blights. That's a common term that we hear. It's sometimes applied to fungi and sometimes applied to bacterial infections, plants. So blights are, what they typically mean is, it's an old English word meaning rapid death of foliage. In that case, it's a blight on the plant. And so blights can be in all sorts of forms. The common name for it is not necessarily scientific because it can apply to a lot of different groups of fungi. So early blight on tomatoes, downy mildews on some cucurbits will be a blight. Anthracnose can cause a blight, late blight on tomatoes. So it's more about this really devastating kind of damage that can occur to the plants when it really gets accelerated. And so some of it includes dieback. Now, dogwood anthracnose will cause dieback, which is a fungal. This is actually a bacterial called fire blight that's on apple trees and crab apples and other fruits like that. Can be a problem. So it will basically, kill the tips of that plant, but it's a bacteria. We'll talk about bacteria in a minute. Blights, blights are applied to a couple of different types of organisms. All right, and then turf grass gets blights too. So you've got Rhizoctonia and others that are problems when you get long wet periods and high fertilizers and stuff like that. You can really amp up certain types of blights in there. And that's basically a different expression of it. So you're killing the turf off in this rather kind of rapid destruction and death of that. And you can see what it looks like on the leaves. So this would have been nice green tissue, but it's definitely taking, and killing that part of that plant. So this is a fungal or fungal-like organism causing this damage. Then there are other kinds of things like lesions. I showed you some of those cankers on the chestnuts. There are other things that can happen to kind of fresh, tender rootstocks of plants. So stem lesions along the stem, as it's particularly towards the base of the soil, it can cause lesions and even this thing called damping off, pinching off of the plant, basically kind of killing it where it's at the base of that soil. So there's problems in that case. Then there's root rots, and once we get into the wet season and things like that, or wet spots in lawns, we can get a couple of different types of what once were classified as fungi, but are technically water molds. So I kind of lumped everything in fungi, but water molds are kind of a different group that have different cell walls, so they're genetically different, et cetera, but they do things a lot like fungi. So in places where you have a lot of water and you're trying to grow roots in those sections, sometimes that will have the advantage. It may be feeding on dead organic matter and then turn over and hit those roots and damage them. The above ground portions of the plant look like they're either stunted or they may be starting to yellow or something like that in that process. So Phytophthora and Pythium are water molds that are notorious problems as far as root rots go. Let's see. And so there's root rot. So in this case, you have nice, fine, healthy leaves. You almost think that's fungal, but that's actually root hairs growing kind of a little bit root bound pot. This one, though, is all those roots are darkened, diseased from that black root rot. And so the above ground portions of the plant, I don't know if it's the best comparison. The one thing about them is these leaves technically be healthy, but of course there's a couple of yellows there. But this is where this kind of wilting is occurring above that plant because it's killing the roots. They're not able to get the nutrients and water and stuff up to them like that. Let's see. Then I mentioned damping off, so I got a little ahead of myself, but this is a seedling disease. So little tender plants, when they're first coming up in the soil, if they're exposed to some of these water molds, it will start to feed on them sometimes right around where they have their connection with the soil. So a rapid death of seedlings in seed beds or places like that, damping off, kind of pinching off. It looks like you have this stem that's grown, but then the fungus starts to affect it right around that base of the soil. So Rhizoctonia, Pythium, and Fusarium, those are all things that are going to cause problems. Pythium is a water mold but the others, there's other fungal disease problems that are related to that. And these are damping off in a float bed situation where you've got plants that you're trying to grow, and the float bed water in hydroponics can sometimes get infected with. So they have to keep treating that water with a type of fungicide to keep the damping off out of it. So I guess you're starting to see there's a lot of different types of fungi that do a lot of different things. And it's not possible to know all of them, but if you know the plants, you know the condition, you know the season, you can definitely narrow some things down as to what things might be. And over here we have one of the geniuses in ability to do that, Carla Keene. She's able to identify these things and know what they are based upon these plants, because she's had to do this so many times. She's seen so many different things. I just want to make sure that I'm providing a lot of material, but the fact is it's not possible to know all of them. But fortunately, there's a lot of websites and apps these days that are available to do that. And also folks who know this day in and day out are experts in that. So, That's it. Many times, with plant pathology, it's almost like an apprenticeship to know it, because it's not possible to know everything. So just don't feel daunted, but keep on trying. And fortunately, there's so many more resources available to you through these websites and apps. So here's a little bit more Pythium disease that's damping off. There's that pinching off. You can see it's darkening it, necrosis, cutting off the life of that plant, and you can see they're all kind of wilting due to this fungal infection, either Pythium, water mold, or Rhizoctonium. So how to stop this? There are a series of seed treatments. So if you have seedlings, if you have them protected at their early stages, as long as they can get up and growing, get some roots going in the ground, get themselves up and photosynthesizing, they can help kind of stave off some of the real bad problems. But when they're tiny, they just have little root bases. It's just like, any young offspring, they're going to have trouble with diseases at a certain point until they have protection. But you can treat these with different types of seed treatment. If you go to the co-op, sometimes you'll see this pink color on your seeds, and that may be Mancozeb or Maneb or things like that. That is enough to get that plant growing and up and out of the ground, and keeping it one step ahead of whatever fungus or disease might get it. A lot of different types of seed treatments that are available. And this one, I think what they're doing is they're treating it with a fungicide against that looks like watermelon seeds. Pre-treating the seeds in here. Sometimes you can mix them up in a mixer or things like that to make sure it covers the seeds and gives them that protection. But many times they're available for sale that way. Okay, so that's that damping off for those little seedling plants. Other things will hit actual fruits, as they're growing. And that's because fruits are really good at producing lots of rich, sugary, sweet nutrition and things like that. And fungi love them. Certain fungi are going to really tear into them. So brown rot is a very common problem on peach trees in different parts of the world, and can really take over. If you get an infection of that, it'll spread and eat up that fruit and turn it into a little dried out mummy, basically. And then with spores that in the spring will start infesting that same orchard again. Anthracnose is a fungal disease of strawberries, and then certain types of white rot lesions in apple. Lots of different ways that fungi will damage fruits. My students and I, we do this thing called, we do a test. We'll take certain peaches from the grocery store and see which kinds of fungi might be on them. And then we have to vector them and plate them, put them out on a Petri plate to let them grow out, and then reinfect another peach tree. And if that's the causal agent, then we can replate it again and go through the Koch's postulates for proof of pathogenicity. I'm sorry. But it's a lot of P's, but you're basically able to, if you can track it that way, it's a way to understand this is the actual causal agent of it. And brown rot is a classic agent. We also sometimes will find that botrytis, that gray mold that you find sometimes in grocery stores. So that's fruit lesions. Then there are these stem lesions or cankers. Awful sounding word, but that's basically what's happening is this fungal organism is in a tree. The living growing part is around here, around the sheath of cambium. And if the fungus gets into that and starts killing it, it can girdle the whole tree and kill everything above it, like happened with the chestnuts or certain parts of dogwood and fracas. This tree is still trying to struggle to survive it. And there's another apple tree fungus that's causing it, but it's sunken lesions. So basically the tree is growing well, but then the fungus gets in and causes this retraction and death around that section. So some trees can still survive under the roots, but everything above that is being killed. So cankers, and then there's wilts, and wilting is tricky sometimes. We had a lot of wilts this year, but a lot of that had more to do not with fungi, but with lack of water. And you'll have those things. But certain types of fungi can get into the vascular system of the plant and clog it up. Basically just cutting off the water to the above ground portions, and they're just going to wilt like they would if it were drought. If you get certain things like southern blight or other kinds of wilts, there's a bacterial wilt that will also cause some things like this, but it's definitely dramatic, and that plant's dead. It's over with, and it kills this thing will kill that plant and then produce its spores so that it can grow out in the next year. There's one that's called verticillium wilt that can be a problem. It gets in the vascular tissue, xylem and phloem, and kills the things above it. Fusarium wilt's another problem. And so it's more like a yellowing in that, a chlorosis and death of leaves, as opposed to a true full wilt, but it's clogging up that same vascular tissue and not letting the nutrients get up to the rest of the plant. All right, so that's many of the typical types of fungal infections. So you can see it's a lot. There's a lot. There are some other issues with fungi that are called witch's brooms, or this kind of bunchy growth on certain trees. If you get that into there's certain types of fungi and also viruses that will cause that. Or other issues that are things like on blackberry rosette disease. So a healthy plant has nice fruits on it. These are not producing good fruits. What you've got in this case is a weird kind of growth that the fungus makes the plant do. It's basically taking over part of its genetics and causing it to grow in an abnormal way in that case. And then there's also stunting. Certain types of fungi will cause stunting in plants. Now, these are not fungi, but there's others that will do that, and others that cause gall. So this one I'm going to pass around. You're going to be a little careful with it. This is a burl or a fungal infection on a tree that started when the plant was still fresh and kind of green and tender, and kind of forced the plant to grow like this. And part of the reason is so that it can feed off of all the wonderful sweet secretions and then continue to grow and make this weird looking structure. It's a little heavy. I'll pass that around so you can see that. But there's a lot of different types of galls. This is a gall on the azalea leaf. So it's forcing, this as you can see, it's growing during the fresh tender times, but it'll eventually force that in some woody plants that'll force a really hard nodule structure. I'm going to pass another one around. This is a oleander gall. This is actually a bacterial gall on a Pseudomonas syringae on a oleander. And so it's basically forcing the plant to grow in a weird way so that it can get the food from it. And the plant itself doesn't necessarily die, but it's definitely being drained of its resources. And the fungus just keeps on going, or whatever the organism that's causing that. Peaches will get this thing called leaf curl. It causes these strange little lumps and nodules on it, basically forcing the plant to grow in that strange way. Many times it's genetic. So basically they're getting in, they're taking over the DNA of it and forcing the plant to grow in that very weird way. And then some of them look like this. Anybody see this before? Sort of in orchards. Black knot on that can be very common in plums in particular, and basically need to be pruned out, that process. But that started when the plant was still green and tender. And then by this time of year, you're seeing this kind of hard, ugly growth, this kind of very nasty looking thing that just, causing the plant to grow haywire. It's something to do with taking over some of the growth hormones of the plant, depending on the species. But that's one that you sometimes can find in orchards. So, again, fungi, I said that they were very diverse kingdom of organisms, and many of them really love plants and have made their livings off of plants. Lots of different ways that they'll do that. This one here is called anthracnose, and it's a common name for it, but many times there's different species that actually do this. So it's basically, it's a different kind of fungus, and it's causing some kinds of issues, but the oak anthracnose is not the same as strawberry anthracnose. It's just another common name that's used for it. Many times you have to look up the scientific name to know the difference between some of those. Okay, so you have just made it through the fungi and all of the first half of this talk. I've probably gone through it a little too fast, but anyway, what kind of questions do you all have about some of this stuff? Yes. That's a good question. We're going to kind of get to some of that in the second part of it, but there's a series of different ways, depends on the species, depends on the species of plant that you're trying to protect. But there are different types of techniques. Some of them involve cultural techniques, and maybe mechanical techniques. There are some even biological techniques that aren't used that much. And then there's chemical techniques as well. So a lot of different kinds of treatments. Some of the quote unquote chemical techniques may be labeled as organic in their controls, because you can get things like neem can actually control insects and certain fungal diseases, but it's not perfect, as many have found. But that can be used in organic production. A series of other things that might include metal-based things like a copper fungicide, which is not, some certain types of copper are actually labeled for organics, but there's others that are like that. Then there are some that are synthetic chemicals that are used. So we'll get into some of that in the second half of this year. And really, my question and pretty much cop out is, it depends when it comes to it. Because there's so many species of plants we're trying to protect, and so many potential species of fungi that may be attacked. But some things are easier to control than others, and some are at certain times of a season easier to control. Depends. It's something that fungi don't like, or certain fungi, it may have something to do with. There's a series of things that it's preventing growth of fungi and things like that. But that's been a common one. There's a whole series of copper-based fungicides that were originally produced in the dough mixture. So the earliest things that were discovered, and a series of other things like that.
Not really a question.
Yes, question.
Just a comment. Gosh, these fungi sound like nefarious. Like I've been hearing you describe everything, and I'm like, bro.
Yeah, it does sound like a horror show. Keep in mind, fungi are just been a part of the natural world for a very long time, and many of their foods are plants. That's what they grew to develop on. And so, it's a part of the natural world, but when we try to grow certain plants in abundance that are very rich and luscious, sometimes they're more susceptible to fungi. Other plants that are in the wild are resistant. That's one thing I forgot to mention. Getting resistant seeds and varieties is one of the most important ways of staving off many of these diseases. So if you buy on seed packets, you can buy some that are automatically resistant, then you don't have to spend a lot of money on various fungicides. But you're right, it does sound, the pictures that Alan and Steve chose are really kind of nasty. And there's times when we have these things. But there are ways to moderate it. So we're hoping to get to some of that in kind of the second part of this. So all right, I've gone on for a very long time. It's 7 o'clock.
I have a question.
Yes, question. Okay.
This leaf right here in the top left, what is this? What is this fungi here?
It's an anthracnose fungus on there. And that is it's mainly, many times the anthracnose is what it looks like. That's the name of it. But each one of these causal agents is different in the blackberries versus the dogwoods versus the looks like plane tree and other things like that. So it kind of depends on, many times it depends on the species as to what it is, even though smuts and rusts and blights are all named. It's really the scientific names that help us understand what they might do.
Well, I was asking that because I have an apple tree that the leaves kind of look like that, and then
Mhm.
now it's gotten darker. Carla just left me hanging. My apple tree is just
Uh-huh.
I,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
just put some spray. I have some organic fungal spray, and I want to
Okay.
say that it's copper based because it's organic, but
Yeah.
um, yeah.
Well, and so I'm not sure exactly which one that one is. This is about the time of year when most of the leaves are falling off the tree, so it may not be as effective. But there are certain times of the year that are better than others for treating them. Sometimes it's in the spring, depending upon the species. Sometimes it may be later in the season. There's a series of different timings of these things that may be important. Um, Sometimes, like for me, if I'm going with organic, I'm treating, what I can with whatever of those organic sprays I've got. Uh, but it's hard to make a blanket statement for all diseases and all plants. We have to kind of treat them on an individual basis. If that makes sense.
Okay.
All right, good. Well, thanks. So I know it's a good time for break for all this stuff. Okay, good. Let's take a break, then we'll get into the bacteria and the viruses and nematodes and some of the controls. The bacteria and viruses, nematodes are a shorter chapter, so we'll get through this. Not sure she wants to change all that.
We have a tree. Yeah, that's right. Whatever happens, that fungicide the plants start doing that screen very well. And it usually happens when it's turning tender, and then it gets bigger because it's accumulating. And so it's become really back and back.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, there's some of them, there's certain types of growth that are fungal, some that are viral. It's mostly been able, I don't know that one. So the tree is probably trying to wall it off. But I follow some of the
Yeah, I'll just check and see if there was any questions.
That guy answered.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay.
But she was asking about an apple tree, which is a spot like this, such as my tree. And I didn't know that this time of the season, most of those leaves are small.
Yeah. That's great. Well, this time of the year, they can move on the spot. It's a good cleanup of the work. Yes, I can go there again. Everything.
I thought we were gonna get free stuff in October. It stayed on, maybe process and something. About it.
Yeah, they got 34. Riley, I don't think it's. Yeah. Old training. You find it there. We have it on. This year. And I've never been there. Yeah. I'm interested in watching. I want to stay.
It's a beautiful.
Yeah. It looks like hardwood. Hardwood, but usually that's here. Do you have an iPhone? It's not. That's what it is. Now, get ready. Yeah, make sure.
She's looking like this.
Yeah.
And the reason showing the red. Sapping. I don't know. I don't have an app. Those kind of. Okay. Yeah. I know, I think it's worth reason. Okay. That's why. Further back. Yeah. Right. When I think of
guide that you, I should get that guide that you all have, so I can link it up better to that. But mainly, I've just got this thing that they gave me back on all the numbers.
Right. Right. I haven't read that whole guide. I just haven't.
I understand. There's so much material that you all have access to.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Kind of been a as need basis.
That's mostly what
Really good resource to have.
yeah, that's what it comes down to. For me, I had to memorize that back in school and grad school. And then I go back, I have all these different resources, so many more resources than we have.
So Carly, do you want to tell them a little bit about the strawberry thing? You think that would be? Yeah.
Not now, because I don't know a whole lot of, I mean, just have that basic information.
All right. Is everybody about ready to start up with the bacteria and the rest of it here? Okay, good. Okay. All right, good. I realize again, it's a lot. We covered in a very short time, something that usually takes me a couple of weeks in my plant pathology class to treat properly, you know, because there's so many different groups of fungi that do different things. And having an understanding of that takes a while, but fortunately there are a lot of resources. You've got them here in your guidebooks and things like that. And there's a number of these resources that are available online for you to be able to help identify some of those things. But I want to move on next. We talked about the fungi, probably the most important of these diseases. But bacteria also can cause problems. And particularly when you get wet weather and things like that, or wet conditions, they tend to like those kinds of conditions more than others. And so these are tiny single-celled organisms. We kind of are familiar with them, although we've never seen them because they're so very small, smaller than any one of our cells. They're kind of the size of, say, the mitochondria, or little organelles inside our cells. Very, very tiny things. And they're very simple, but they can reproduce fast. That's their thing. They're just rapidly reproducing and sometimes causing some big problems and absorbing, nutrition from whatever that they're going at. Some of these plants, these bacteria have to knock out the plant and then smash their cells up, dissolve their cells, and then eat all that rich goodness inside them, or absorb all that rich goodness inside. And some of them are pretty toxins they can produce to damage the plants so that they can then make this food relationship with them. These again lack nuclei. The plant pathogenic bacteria don't produce spores. There's others that are spore producers, like in the insect world. If you ever use a thing called BT to control certain caterpillars, or like the tomato worms, they can produce a spore form. And that powder that you put on, that dipel or whatever it is, that's a sporulated form of this thing that has a crystalline protein that kills the insects. But these critters, the plant pathogenic bacteria, don't produce spores, and they reproduce rapidly and spread with moisture. So sometimes little raindrops will be dropping along your plants underneath, and it will splash the bacteria onto the plants. You may have these little spots and drop from the droplets and things like that, depending upon the conditions. Again, it's a susceptible plant. And what kind of pathogen? I had there's the plant disease triangle. Starts out with a susceptible plant host. What's this? Virulent pathogen. And what about the conditions? Favorable environmental. So all those three. So it's wet, it's bacteria, and a plant that's susceptible, and all that stuff will kind of spread that situation. The symptoms, there's many different kinds. So you have leaf spots in bacteria, sometimes little tiny leaf spots. Blights, they'll take off the tips of plants or kill entire parts of plants. Things called soft rots that we don't as much talk about with fungi, although sometimes fungi do rots. But a soft rot is this kind of nasty, gooey, oozy stuff. I guess that's the scientific term there. But soft rots are typically that way. So if you have like potatoes and one of them starts to kind of really turn nasty, or old carrot, that's a bacterial soft rot. Then others will actually clog up the vascular tissue. Some fungi do it. Bacteria can do it really well in things like squashes and cucumbers and things like that. They'll clog up those vascular tissues. And just like the fungi, bacteria can cause galls, maybe not as impressive as this one, but there's a bunch of them that they can do as well with strange galls. So this one, the one I showed you in the oleander, that's a bacterial gall. There's another one called crown gall that feeds on a bunch of different, there's actually a Pseudomonas syringae. It's a crown gall that will feed, it's an Agrobacterium tumefaciens. So tumor is part of its name. So it's basically forcing that plant to grow these weird growths. And it can sometimes be at the base of the plant and cause some real damage. And certainly if you're trying to sell an ornamental plant, that's not usually what some homeowners don't want to buy. So bacteria have lots of different ways. And then cankers too, these sunken lesions as part of it.
Before we take the break, if you could cut off the galls on some of the plants, could you put them off any?
I mean, like if it depends on species. Now, the insect stuff, back when I was talking about, there's certain insect galls, they'll cause some things. If you can get them early enough, that may be successful, but when it's springtime, they'll come out and reinfest. Some types of galls you can prune away. Others may have gotten in the vascular system and spread. It just kind of depends on sometimes on species and conditions with it. But if you have something out on the edge or the tip, maybe you can prune some of that off. Hopefully that will be enough to stop it, depending on the species. The blights that I mentioned, I showed fire blight before, but it's been a real problem, particularly with certain orchard trees. You can see this kind of darkness and the leaves that are dying like this. This is a bacterial killing, typically on those tips of that plant initially at first, sometimes with the blossom blight sections as well. And basically, this is just a necrosis, a death of those tissues is what's happening there. And that's bacterially caused. It caused, when I was at University of Delaware, they talked about There used to be, all the peach orchards used to be in Delaware, Delmarva Peninsula. And nobody, where do peaches typically grow now? We think of it, Georgia and South Carolina and Alabama. That's typically where we find peach production, where the massive peach production was. But at a certain point, I think in the 1800s, the peach crop in Delaware was just wiped out by this fire blight. You know, their orchards were taken out, and the industry ended up moving. So that was one of the places. Plus, they also sometimes they get really cold snaps that are not as great for peach trees. Anyway, bottom line is fire blight can be a problem in a lot of different tree crops. We were talking about the galls. This is that crazy looking crown gall of Euonymus, Agrobacterium tumefaciens, causing this really nasty looking growth. You know, it looks like something from outer space, but it's just, again, taken in, forcing the plant to grow these weird shapes so that they put out all kinds of extra sugars and nutrients. The bacteria can live and reproduce in those sections. Apple trees can get it, they can get it on plums, entering many times through wounds. So the base of the soil, sometimes you have damage in that, and that is an entry point for things like bacteria. There's also a spotting on tomatoes that is a bacterial spot. And we also know there's some viral spots and there's some fungal spots. So it's not always easy, but these tend to be little tiny peppery looking spot sections. That leads to some chlorosis, and then these little tiny spots that are being damaged by the bacteria there. And so there's a bacterial spot of pepper plants too. So you can see that's actually, some of those are kind of growing together, kind of spreading. You see a combination of necrosis and chlorosis in that process there. And then there's some on English ivy. Anybody ever see this before? Certain like real wet spots and places like that. I've seen at Austin Peay campus, there's a bunch of this, and you'll see each year certain times when some of the leaves get this bacterial spot, because all that wetness down there is really good for spreading the bacteria. Some of them will even, the plants, like I mentioned, they'll wall off sections of it and just basically give it up, sacrifice that part. And then you have these shots. It's like someone took a shotgun or something to the leaves, and it's just where the bacteria got in there. And some plants have that, but the plant itself survives. This is not super marketable laurel tree when it looks like that. But sometimes you can just do pruning of things like that, but it just depends. In a place like this, it's probably pretty wet, and it gave the advantage to that bacteria. Environmental conditions can influence, what those bacteria can do. They may have been there for a while, but in that case, it was enough for that to infect that tree. And then others will cause a scorching of leaves, sort of like a killing. You can see the green stuff is in the middle sections along those veins, the plant, the vascular system. But much of that has killed it around the edges of those leaves. And this one's one that's vectored by an insect, a little leaf hopper, that causes this problem. And this is a tree that's pretty much on its way out. And what are the salvagings of these oak scorch?
There's not much salvage. They get drought stress on top of having the bacterial scorching. There is no treatment for the bacteria. You have to treat it for the leaf hopper.
Yeah, that's no
The leaf hopper is what's going to be feed, and you can treat that big, it's very expensive.
Yeah, you got to get it at just the right time to kill those insects. Yeah, it's all got to be the right time.
It's hard to get it, because when you get early spring, you have to start coming up. And so that chemical very hard to control.
We've had a few pinhooks on Austin Peay campus that were taken out because of that. That and the fact that they built a parking lot over its root system.
Oh, yeah, that makes.
That was a bad combination. The trees themselves and plants, if you can give them a healthy start, they're able to defend themselves better. But when they're, when you stack the deck against them, it makes it harder. They're weaker. If they don't have the right nutrients, you got concrete all around them and just a little spot for rain, it makes it tough for many trees to survive and grow. And so that's some of the things that they talk about. Making a healthy agronomic start for your plant
can make a difference. It gives it the advantage. It makes it less susceptible and, more able to defend itself. But that's a bacterial disease. This is the one I was talking about where it's a wilt. So this is what happens with certain types of muskmelons when they get infected with this bacterial wilt. This fungus gets into the vascular tissue and kills everything, down the end of it. So it'll clog it up, so it can't get the nutrients, can't move the material around. And this is, if you cut one of those apart, you can't see the bacteria, but you can see this fine, sticky ooze that they're living. That's evidence of bacteria, even though it's not the individual bacteria. So that means those things are clogged with this kind of sticky, mucoidal looking kind of goo. And that's death for the rest of that top of that plant. Sometimes you can prune that off, but other times that's, there's not much left of that plant. And there may be some resistance, but the only way to stop that one, wouldn't it be a systemic fungicide or something? Just pruning it, getting it out of the garden. So it's not rotation. Question. If it wasn't part of that, it wasn't infected itself, it's going to be fine. Mostly.
Yeah.
Sometimes, if a plant like that is not been able to provide for it, it will eventually start to wilt and wither too, along with the rest of it.
Usually fruit of development.
That's not very ripe. That's before its prime, before it's ready for picking, and so it's not going to be a whole lot. You usually want that to go nice and big, so thunk it and all that stuff. But when that plant is dead like that, it's probably not marketable at that stage. But I don't think it's going to be toxic or poisonous to you or things like that. But it's you can get it in a lot of those cucurbit crops. If you catch them before it's too late, then it's okay. But some of this is pretty advanced disease. So bacteria, there's a whole lot of other things with bacteria. There are some types of antibiotic components that can be used to control them. Various antibiotic bactericides that are called they're called mycins of some kind or other. They're not cheap when it comes to this. It's just like any other kind of antibiotic in that case. So that's fungi and bacteria. Then the viruses, this group of DNA or RNA that basically takes over the genetics of the plant and makes it make many copies and repeats, can be a real problem. They're so small and they're so weird looking. Some of them have dodecahedron shapes when you actually get to see it, or some of them are kind of broad shaped, or other kinds. There's a whole series of different kinds of viral particles. They're so small, it's hard to see any of that stuff without a scanning electron microscope. People first discovered them because they could actually filter them out with a ceramic filter in water, and so they would keep those out. Like the first one was tobacco mosaic virus. They were able to separate out of things. And if you go to any kind of tobacco store or something like that, you can probably find leaves that have tobacco mosaic virus in them. So if you're a tobacco user, you don't want to go touch your solanaceous plants after you've been working with tobacco, because it can have those viral particles. They always say no smoking in the greenhouse or stuff like that, because it can affect tomatoes and other things like that. But viruses have really weird kind of unique properties. Some of them can force the plant to grow, or to these infections to kind of start out at a central locus. So they're taking over the DNA, causing it to basically cause the plant to make copies of itself. And then the plant will try to kind of protect itself, and then it'll expand past that point. So you get these weird ring-shaped projections, like in patients there, necrotic spot viruses. Others are tomato spotted wilt virus. This is a very common one that ends up happening, certainly usually towards the later part of the season. I tend to find some of these in places. And unfortunately, they can become a problem if you plant tomatoes in the same place over and over again. They can be an issue, or if you've got insects vectoring some of those things. This is, some of the things. And so you can see wilting kind of the plant itself, causing necrosis of leaves. And then these weird spot-like formations. This wasn't an insect, this is a virus that forced the plant when it was ripening to grow, in these strange ways where it took over parts of the DNA in those cells. And that's not a super marketable crop, probably not nearly as nutritious, or rich. The viruses took it over. These are viruses, though, that attack plants. They're not people viruses. So I'll say, look, for the vast majority of those, we're not having something that's infectious that way. It's just a plant pathogenic virus. And then there's mosaic viruses that cause a mosaic pattern of infestations. There's many different kinds of those. There's some are on beans, the advanced stage. This is tobacco mosaic virus on tomatoes. You can see several of these little sections should have been nice and fresh and green and fully inflated, but then here they're just kind of, strange warbled growths. I don't know what the best way to describe that is, but in a mosaic pattern. And so tobacco gets it, tomatoes get it, peppers can get it. There's a series of different plants in the same family that are susceptible to that one. Then there's the other mosaic viruses. So tobacco mosaic virus transmitted on hands if you have tobacco products on it, or if you've been working with infected plants, that's a way to spread it. Sometimes if you have to go into a greenhouse, they want you to wash off your hands and also your boots and stuff like that, so you're not tracking in pathogens to have your biosecurity. But again, it's patches of light and dark green tissues in that process. So that's just a small smattering of viral diseases, many different kinds. Some of them are vectored by insects like aphids, which have those long stylets that drink the juice of the plant. And it's a description I give to students. It's kind of like, in order to get that sap to flow into the aphid, they have to spit up saliva and then suck it back up again. When they do it, they're spitting viral particles into the plant and sucking back up, and that's how it's spread. So it's like spit and suck. That's the typical thing that several of those piercing sucking insects do. So the insect is the key to many times to controlling some of those viral diseases. You can control the aphids or other issues like that. You might be able to reduce some of those. Okay, so the rounding out the biotic organisms is the nematodes. These are the roundworms, truly animals. They are worms. In this world, there are many different types of worms. Nematodes are those worms. Let's see, this is a pinewood nematode. The plant parasitic, there's a lot of nematodes. Some are predatory on other critters in the soil. Some are going to feed on bacteria. This one has a hypodermic needle that works backwards. So it sucks up the juice of the plant. It pierces the root and drinks all that plant sap out of it. And so that's one that's about to go, towards a plant. Basically, usually it's swimming around in the film of water in the soil around the roots. And they get up near that root and they can sense all that rich kind of sugary secretions coming off the roots. And so they go swim towards that, start to drink that juice. And some of them will set up their systems for the rest of their lives and produce their egg cases there. So this is a drawing of a nematode, which includes, it's a fully functioning organism. It's very, very simple, but it's got a full digestive tract, muscular system, the piercing sucking mouth part stylet, nervous system. None of the viruses or fungi have any of that stuff. This is a true animal species. And this one is a female, so it's got a lot of eggs in it, producing eggs with nematodes in it, et cetera. Or they can produce, their whole bodies can become an entire egg case at a certain time. There's the stylet, which does the drinking of the plant juice. Some of them will cause real problems with roots. This is a really bad case of root knot nematode on tomatoes. That's cantaloupes and tomatoes. The thing about it is, instead of having a nice, fresh, fibrous root system, they're feeding on it, wounding it, damaging it, pruning it back, and then causing these weird nodulated growths. Fortunately for us, we don't have as many root knot nematodes unless we've got sandy soils. They like to swim in larger pore spaces. Did you all have a soils talk in here about things like that? So what are the 3 soil texture particles? You remember them? Sand, silt, and clay. Yeah. So sand is the largest, even though we think that's small. And then silt is smaller, kind of like fine flour. And then clay is the smallest. We tend to have a lot more clay in the soil. Very hard to find sand around here unless you go to the riverbanks, or you go down to the river where the big sand mountain is down there. They come stock it. Places where there's sand, like in the coastal plain, root knot nematodes are a big problem, but we don't tend to have as much of those. Maybe up on the Cumberland Plateau, they're going to have some more root knot nematodes. But have you ever seen much root knot nematodes around here on stuff?
Well, no.
Well, and that's a cyst nematode in soybeans. So, but the root knot is not so common here. But it shows some of the damage. Some of them can also destroy impatiens. They're damaging the root systems. That's the big thing. So everything that's got to rely on that is going to wilt and die or shrivel and stunt. And so there's some really nasty, root nodules. That should be nice, fine, fibrous root systems. It's the nematodes have pruned it. There's so many nematodes doing it. Not just one, but like lots and lots of them swimming around in there. Pretty small. Like many of those nematodes are maybe the size of a tiny eyelash. You're not going to see them very easily. A few of them will produce these little cysts on the root that you might see. Like a soybean plant will have a nodule that looks maybe the size of a pencil eraser size. This is a small size, smaller than that when we're talking about on a root. We do have problems in soybeans with these. Soybean cyst nematode can build up over years and form these little lemon-like cysts. And you can see them if you pull out the roots and wash them. But it's something that farmers have to deal with a crop rotation to deal with those. There's some that are also foliar, although they're pretty rare. The nematodes can get up into the leaf structures and feed. If you ever seen the leaf cells, there's many times 7 layers of cells, and they get in there and feed on that kind of component. And they've damaged this leaf in here, basically destroying those parts in there, feeding on it. Not so common, but that's a possibility. There's some emerging from leaf tissue. They're really microscopic. You have to look at most of these under a microscope in order to see them actively, kind of moving and things like that. I didn't really get to show the cyst itself. This is basically what was once a female nematode had moved to a certain section and set up shop, set up her feeding relationship. That was enough to feed all of her eggs. And when she died, then all of the eggs inside are in an egg case. So they wait till the next season. Whenever the conditions are right, they'll emerge. And so in soil where you have nematodes, you tend to have these kind of areas that grow and expand kind of slowly, these kind of spots in the field that will do that. Unless you're kind of pulling a tractor through and moving them from place to place where they're kind of elongate. But they're not necessarily fast movers in soil, but they can grow up. And if they reproduce a lot, eventually you have a place you really can't grow a lot of different crops. You may have to alternate the crop that would be not susceptible to it. So those are all the critters that are part of that. Now, on to the most important part I think everybody's looking for is the management. What do we do about these things? There's a series of different ways to control them. It depends. There's a multiple of techniques. Did you all talk about integrated pest management at all? And any of this stuff? I think we talked about it with the insect side of it. But if you can use multiple control techniques, many times that can be as effective as just doing one chemical spray. Sometimes there are a series of different techniques that you can use to reduce some of the problems that might be there. Some of them include cultural or think agricultural. What do we do culturally for plant production practices that lessen disease? There's a series of different things. So crop rotation would be one of those. A lot of folks will do those sorts of things. There's a series of different techniques that can be done that way. Then, of course, chemical control. Everybody thinks, what do I spray? There's so many different answers to that because there's many different types of chemistries that can be used for controlling them. Man-made or naturally occurring chemical compounds. So neem is one of those things. Sometimes some types of soaps of fatty acids of potassium salts, et cetera, potassium salts of fatty acids, or a series of other kind of metal-based chemical controls like the copper sulfates and things like that. And then there are some places where you can buy, like go down to Gardens of Babylon. They've got all kinds of stuff. You can purchase some of these antagonistic fungi that compete with they compete with the other organisms. And so when they do that, they can basically push them out. You can buy soils that are suppressive soils. Now that's an expensive proposition, and it only works for certain species, but it can be applied from time to time. Then there's this thing called regulatory control, and that is the thing that is hopefully keeping out different types of diseases from the country. When I first got out of college, I worked for the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service of the USDA and the Plant Protection and Quarantine. And so we were doing a variety of things, but there are folks at ports of call that are looking at shipments. Does this have disease that needs to be treated? Is this crop going to be rejected, at the port of call? So we don't have more of these chestnut blights or things like that. There's a whole series of things. One of my graduates is now the state plant inspector for western part of Tennessee. He goes to nurseries and stuff like that, Tim Robertson. So we'll go to these nurseries, and he's found several different things where they've had to treat the nurseries and stuff like that. If you can contain some of the species, that's regulatory types of control. Many times set up legally. So there's a series of laws that are set up to prevent the spread of certain pathogens. Sometimes that involves quarantines to keep from shipping different infected produce. Unfortunately, that didn't work for us with this. What is the name of that thing again? Can you read that name to us again? Yeah, the strawberry disease. Gnocchi. Okay, yeah. So this is a fungus that's really causing some problems with that, but it got out initially into parts of the East Coast and then spread this way.
Yeah. Canada, so that made all of the strawberry transplants that everybody bought around the country were infected. So now we have fields all over the infected. Sitting in the south works because we have the pine growing fire for that pond.
Warm and wet.
Really aggressive right now. And the chemicals that are recommended also lead. So there's some issues that need to be discussed.
And so they're trying to stop, like, did they say stop planting? Stop planting the seedlings, like basically they tried to quarantine some of it out.
Yes. Dr. Lockwood or pretty much he was recommending people to be shift.
Yeah.
So the sun growers, the seed shipments, plants back. Plants are supposed to be short because we don't know that every supplier did that. So and some people went ahead and accept the shipment and when it gets planted, then are now already in the crop. So it's a matter of setting up spray schedules that are effective with fungicides. And then just watching in the spring, that's when it can really be really good. Just have to have those times. So we'll see what happens in spring. I'm trying to monitor it and we're writing the grant for kids using research.
Oh, good.
Hopefully we'll get ready to bring it to start in September about. But I've been lucky to get pre-research. So
When she's talking about very important things, detection,
yeah.
the eyes and ears to be able to figure out where this is and to try to stave it off if possible, quarantine it if possible. That's the regulatory side. She's mentioning like destroying of crops. There's a mechanical destruction of them, as well as the regulatory side of it, trying to prevent it from spreading. Like sometimes it can be too fast for the laws, and can get spread. But if there are a series of regulatory methods and plant inspectors that can be part of it to help with that process.
Yeah, I've also been in touch with getting go the Department of Agriculture. And it was just too late to stop the shipment. So and that's things they can go North Carolina and they were already being shipped out right at planting time. And we got the alert.
That's one example where you're using using multiple techniques to try to control it, or physical control, use of temperature or radiation, that's pretty extreme, or just, destruction of that. Like if you've got a bunch of infected potatoes, you don't want them to be put in the same field. You want to put them in a place that's away, a coal pile that's far away. Yeah.
I talked to a few friends of mine in Maine that have farms, small farms, and they weren't affected. But I'm wondering,
By strawberries?
yeah,
Pest, okay.
Well, they have to see, I mean, it's really gonna show.
well, I'm wondering if,
Rear its ugly head come spring.
that's what I'm
They're not
wondering,
gonna
because I
That's
know,
a totally different environment than what we have.
yeah,
They don't have the humidity, the heat.
right.
Environmental conditions, Ken,
Environment.
right conditions, the
Well, that was
warm,
my-
the wet,
I was gonna ask. They plant more new. If they plant new plants, it's gonna show up this spring.
It could.
It could,
They
if
can
they're
have-
not,
They can have the plants tested right now.
Oh.
And like I said, we're developing
yeah,
a spray program, trying to see what's gonna be effective. It's gonna have several different fungicides. There's fungicides in different categories. And so you wanna switch them like every 7 to 10 days, you spray. So,
yeah,
Right
the
now,
reason,
it
the
is
reason for that, there's a reason for switching them up with the chemical
Yes.
controls. If you use the same chemical over and over again, a plant that can produce billions of spores, or fungus that can produce billions of spores, has a billion genetic rolls of the dice to overcome your chemical. So if you use the same chemical over again, eventually you're just going to breed for resistant, spores. But if you change up the chemistries, it's like baseball. If you have a pitcher that's got a fastball, a curveball, and a slider, and a knuckleball, nobody can hit it. But if they're only got one pitch, it better be really good, or eventually you can overcome it. I know baseball analogies don't work as much more than my students, but it's that kind of using a combination of techniques with the chemicals, but also like this. If you can use a combination of those, an integrated pest management system, you have a greater chance of staying ahead of it, or at least reducing some of the resistance that can develop. That's typically. See, when I was in Cameroon doing my PhD work, they used to say that should work, and they said en principe, in principle. In reality, is not always the case. But it's not. Oh my God, you're kidding me? All right. Well, so remember the plant disease triangle. That's candy. It's 8 o'clock. It's 8 o'clock. 8 o'clock. I'm lucky. Okay, good. That's Eastern time. Okay. I thought that's quick. Okay. So you gave me a hard time. We got to realize how fast. One of the things, so we talk about those control techniques. It's also important to remember the disease triangle. So virulent pathogens, susceptible hosts, and favorable environment. If all those things work, then you got this disease problem. If you can address one of those or more of those, you can arrest the development of that. Hopefully that is what can happen. One way to do that is to reduce the inoculum. So inoculum means the amount of infectious material that builds up over time. So whether that is spores or bacterial cells or things like that, or viral particles, that inoculum is what's eventually going to be infective. If you can do things like crop rotation, rotating the plant families, that's another way to kind of stay one step ahead. If you plant the same crop in the same field every year after year, eventually you're going to have some of the same fungi, insect diseases, all that stuff in the soil build up. And then you plant that in, and it's already, the deck is almost stacked against, because you have extra infectious inoculum. If you switch from legumes to solanums, like solanums include the tomatoes and potatoes and things like that, or to cucurbits, the melons, etc., or brassicas, like the cabbages and things. If you can rotate that, many times you can have a different condition so that diseases don't build up year in and year out. It's not always easy. And in gardens, it's kind of hard to do, to shift everything, all at once, but it's possible to do. And you can reduce some of the buildup. So one of the classic cultural control practices for much of that, from annual agriculture production, is this rotation. That's a 4-year rotation that can be by, these plant families, or a grass species, completely different kind of species from a broadleaf to a grass species. So a corn or something like that, that might be that. That's one of the cultural practices that you can use. And I think some folks will, folks have been doing this for a very long time when they discovered the value of that. Certain operations don't work that well. Like you were talking about how the strawberry producers, they set up that field and they've got all that money invested in it. It's hard to shift out of it, what was the guy who he just shifted into a new field, and now he may have these diseases.
Right. That being the crop. The crop on. They had already, and they told them to, they suggested they rotate the crops as a field. And they finally did, and so he did not want to incorporating on his crop. So they opted out of strawberry crop.
Oh. So he's got the apparatus stuff to set up for planting, but he's shifting the crop. So that's a good.
Thousands of tubes that. So they used the plastic that they had set up. Strawberry.
Okay.
So we'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of. They have strawberry.
That's a classic example of that's a combination of things. You're using rotation, cultural technique, and then this black plastic mulch, which is a physical technique or mechanical component of that. So other cultural practices, buying resistant seeds. So if you go to certain stores, that you can see certain things that may have fusarium or verticillium resistance or a bunch of different types of things available. There's certain viral resistance available in seed packets and stuff like that. So that's a very useful thing, because usually you're not spending a lot of extra money for it, and you pretty much avoid a certain type of disease with that. Also now, so saving seed. Now I save seed from my gardens and things like that. There's one problem with it. Over time, you can eventually get infected seed, and when you start with infected seed, you're going to have infected crops. It's not always easy to buy fresh new seed, if you've got some to save. It just kind of depends on the crop many times and what it might be susceptible for. But that's what seed inspector. There's a whole set of seed inspection service at the Tennessee Department of Agriculture that is checking to make sure that the seeds are what they say they are, and those sort of things. Other cultural practices can include controlling various neglected hosts. So this one is one of those black dot on the plum. So they might have to eliminate that and get it out of the area, or at least prune it way back to keep it from spreading in the next season. She also Carl was also mentioning, if you get something like a brown rot of peaches in your little orchard there, cleaning up all the stuff underneath those trees is a really useful thing to avoid some of the spread of it in the spring, because you can't move your peaches every year. They're going to be stuck there. But cleaning out those sanitation is sometimes also very important. Let's see, prune and remove the diseased plant parts, always important. And then also clean off your blades after you do it, because that's going to have the fungus on. That's unfortunately, if you're pruning the same things over and over again, it's important to have some kind of sterilant for it to, in order to go to the next set of prunings. Other things, alternate hosts. Now, it's hard to do this one. If you have cedar apple rust, you've got apple trees. If you have a place like Cedar Hill in the region here, it means there's a lot of cedars because of limestone, and you can't eliminate all the cedars in this area. It's just not possible. Unfortunately, what that means is we're going to have that as persistent. So instead of being able to control, like in the past, they tried to control wheat stem rust by eliminating all the barberry bushes in parts of the Midwest. It was a massive campaign, and it was moderately successful. Wasn't completely successful, but with something like this, it's just not possible to get rid of all those. So you may, instead of having to do cultural practices with alternative hosts, you might have to get resistant varieties of apples and things like that. Yeah. Well, because it was an invasive plant spread by the birds, and it vectored the disease of the rust. So one phase of the stem rust would feed on barberry early in the spring, and then it would shift to the wheat crop. and damage and destroy that. That's, and so this was in parts of the Midwest back in the 80s and such, they were destroying all the barberries, and they had some moderate success with it, but the birds just spread the seeds, and it's almost impossible on a large scale. Alternate host destruction is it's very expensive and sometimes cumbersome and not always effective, but the crop rotation for annual crops is good, but this is one thing that's suggested, but I just am not going to go and try to dig up all the cedar trees, right? It's just too much to do. Other things may include removing diseased plants, roguing, pulling them out, getting them away from your gardens, destroying that potential infectious thing. This is a southern blight on this case of tomatoes. Those are the nasty looking reproductive parts, the sclerotia, those hardened structures that can overwinter. Then in the spring, they're going to grow and spread to these plants. Getting them out of there is of prime importance. If you've got some of these diseased plants in the garden, getting them away from it can be. Some say, well, can I compost those? If you compost it with good heat in a compost pile, process of composting can get up to 155 degrees Fahrenheit if you have the right amount of food and feeding and keeping the brown stuff and green stuff together so that it builds up that way. If it doesn't get hot enough, it might not kill all those fungal spores, and you may have some of that in the compost. I'm not a compost expert, but with diseased plants, it's better not to mess with that. Try to get them away from the crops. So that's all cultural practice, agricultural practice to get rid of some diseases. Others are regulatory, like I mentioned, the quarantines, certification programs, having certified seeds sold free of disease, or certified nursery stock that's uninfected. Not always possible to do, but there's a series of things that are state or federal types of regs that can be used for that. And then the biocontrol I mentioned, it's mostly on a very select basis. Those are products that contain beneficial bacteria or fungi that can help control diseases or moderate the impacts of them. Is probably the best way to describe it. Most of these organisms are naturally occurring, are suitable for organic. Most of these are soil-borne disease to go after soil-borne disease. So you can put in this suppressive soils that will help basically outproduce the fungi that might damage your plants and give the plant a better chance to grow. It's not like an elimination of it, but it's a way to do that sometimes. Not always effective under really high disease pressures. It's not going to be something you can just come in and spray and it's going to stop a thing. It's more something you do when you're starting out to reduce the potential impacts. I don't know of many places that sell those kinds of things unless it's a specialty place like Guards of Babylon or something like that that are focused on that. Sometimes there's things you can order from online for that. So biocontrols are not typical, and this other method you might have heard about is called solarization, or in greenhouse operations you can actually use high heat in soilless mix media like Jiffy Mix and things like that. You can heat it up if it may have been infected to a point where it kills off the diseases and things like that, and then you can plant your greenhouse plants in that mix. But there's also a method that is used in certain places for, say, a fall crop. It's solarization. If you take clear plastic over a place you're going to plant in the fall, in the summer, and allow that plastic to just heat up with the sun, it can kill a bunch of fungal weeds and other things in that soil. And then when it comes ready for planting your fall crop, say in August or something like that, you'll have a quote unquote sterilized soil that can be used to control, to be used to plant your crops. Keep in mind, what do you think that does to the earthworms? You're doing it. They're going to have to go either way down or kind of away from that section. So eventually they'll come back, but it's, there may be some issues with that, but it is a technique that's sometimes used in organic production of fall crops for that. And then the thing that everybody says, what do I spray? The chemical control side of this. Many different species or varieties of these things, but fungicides are for killing fungi or damaging fungi. sometimes they call fungicides things that are damaging or just stopping water molds and things like that. Then bactericides are otherwise known as antibiotics. And then nematicides, which I'm not really strongly recommending typical nematicides because they're highly toxic, restricted use pesticides. But there are some types of things that you can purchase that can help repel certain things, certain nematodes. Some of these are many of these are synthetic chemicals if you're going to go to the Home and Garden Center, but others are natural, which are plant extracts that can control them. And typically, it's best to combine these with other techniques. Because if you just rely on chemicals, those fungi are going to breed, and reproduce rapidly, and many times become resistant if you spray the same thing over again. Like they're talking about spraying every 7 days, but shifting the chemistries so that it doesn't become resistant to it. Typically with fungicides, we're spraying the above ground portions of the plant to control what we see, many times what we see as an infection. But there are some that are systemic that can go through the system of the roots and up through the rest of the plant to stop it. That technique that you mentioned where they injected that chemical into the tree, that's a systemic fungicide that basically keeps the vascular system open so the top of the trees can survive for the elms. But it ain't cheap, and it's a lot of work to make sure you're replacing the canisters and all that stuff to make sure that it's a continuous protection for those. So again, many times these are effective if you have a protective coating on it before the fungus has a chance to take over. Some that are protectants, others that are systemics that are brought in after the disease has been indicated for those. So this is more of general types of things. Some are protectant or systemic. So protectants are the ones that are contact. They provide a protective surface to keep the fungi or other pathogens from damaging the plant. Others are what happens if you get the infection. You can get that into the plant and it goes up through the vascular system, controlling it that way. If you've got aphids or other things like that, vectors of viruses, really the best way to control them with the leaf hoppers is to control the insect itself before they can spread and cause the viral disease. So chemical control is, an important control for many different aspects of agriculture. In order for much of commercial agriculture to continue, they end up having to do some of those control techniques. It's not always the best to do intensive synthetic fungicides because they can have other properties and other issues. But that's sometimes the last line of defense when it comes to controlling. Let's see. So some of the other things I mentioned about strengthening the plant itself, this is not a scientific picture of these strong plants, but making sure that the plant has a balanced nutrition and proper pH is sometimes some of the most important things you can do. Starting it out, a healthy plant means that it's already at least protected. If it's having the wrong pH or the nutrients, it doesn't have the right amount of nutrients, it's already kind of weakened and already going to be potentially more susceptible. If you can strengthen it that way, you reduce the susceptibility. And so sometimes plants that start turning light green to yellow are actually attractive to aphids. They'll come in, drop out of the air, and then feed on those. And if they're vectoring viruses, that is a 1-2 punch on that plant. But if you can make sure there's not too much water, but also just enough, making sure all those sort of things, making sure there's not water stress. And other types of things, but making sure that you do that agronomic preparation so that it gets all the nutrients it needs can go a long way towards helping have healthy plants. If they've got that, then they're going to avoid some of the big disease problems later on. And there's some biological thing, resistant varieties. The marigolds themselves in this case are resistant, but the petunias mostly were wiped out by this Phytophthora variety. Certain species are hardier, particularly African marigolds are very secrete lots of sort of protective chemicals in soil. They tend to be better adapted to it for resistant varieties. but that's just one example of many different types of varieties that are resistant to diseases. And there's also a type of things called PGPRs. They're not very common, but you can purchase those to increase the plant's resistance. So you can apply these plant growth promoting rhizobacteria, PGPRs, that allow for the plant to boost its not immunity but resistance factors, because it doesn't technically have immunity, but it has the ability to boost its own resistance factors. Okay, so those are a series of some of these different types of techniques. There's also some different types of things that you may find at different centers that you can use to try to control them. Quote unquote soft disease control products that aren't fully synthetic chemicals that can many times be used in organic plant control or things like that. Might include soaps and streptomycin, sulfur, copper-based things, bicarbonates and biofungicides, plant extracts and resistance activators. All those, all listed materials other than resistance activators except for organic production. So some of the resistance activators are not part of quote unquote organic production. But there are capabilities, and folks who have to live within that certification scheme have to use these techniques instead of, say, Maneb or Mancozeb or things like that, these chemical preparations. So it kind of depends on what your operations are. And unfortunately, sometimes those plants may get some certain diseases, and there's a bit of a loss that's involved with the process of it. That is part of the reason why it's more expensive to do some of organic production. Other things that can happen is making sure that you've got the right environmental conditions. So making sure water drains properly, or that you're allowing enough air and sunlight penetration into places, that the plants aren't too densely planted together so that they can, not get too much moisture for the fungus to develop. Pruning is a major technique in some of that process, and making sure that the plants that need the sunlight are going to be in those places rather than shade. I remember we had one of our students was working at Dunbar Cave, and they were planting Three Sisters corn gardens, and they had this great place, it was right along the trail. Problem was, right at a certain point, the sunlight shut off. It was just all shade, and so it was a bad place to grow corn because they need a lot of sunlight. Then they moved it out to near where the pond is, and that's a great place for sunlight, but it was really hard to keep watered this season because it was so dry. So it's, there's a combination of things that site selection of gardens can be really important. Make sure it gets enough daylight and environmental conditions are going to be favorable for it. Let's see. Making sure that the irrigation is just right. The Goldilocks method is clear, not too much water, just enough. One problem with sprinkler systems is they leave a lot of water droplets that can sometimes vector plant viruses and things, or plant fungi and things like that. Trying to extend the natural wet period can be a problem. Too much wetness can be a problem with fungi, with those sort of things. Soil drainage can be fundamental to these problems. If you plant a lot of loblolly pines down in a wet spot, it's going to be problematic with its roots. They like to be on dry ridges. There's sometimes things that you can see on the actual plants that say where it's best to grow them. And let's see, raised beds are valuable. There's many reasons for that. Sometimes they can really help avoid certain disease problems, depending. And certain types of soil amendments are useful too. So there's many different factors involved with the control practices. Certain types of things, again, I mentioned several techniques, but some things are going to be better at doing them. So you're not going to rotate your orchards because those are many times growing for many years, but annual plants are good to rotate the plant families. Perennial plants, though, the emphasis has to be on pruning, moving the source of inoculation. You've got a fruit tree growth. You want to make sure it's not at the bottom of a hill where it's going to get all wet. It's not the top of the hill where it's going to get knocked down by wind. Many times they like the airflow on a gentle slope and things like that. And keeping it open enough to allow airflow, through those areas. You have lots of water that sits in a place, it can be great breeding grounds for fungi. Lots of excess humidity. Let's see, make air circulation and also allow better spray penetration. Greenhouses, also you got to make sure that it's sanitary, keeping, the pests or diseases out of the greenhouse, making sure it's not crazy humid. That's always a constant issue. Anybody here have greenhouses that they're working with? So there's always that balance, and sometimes the balance tips. Like greenhouse at Austin Peay has had problems certain time in the summer where I can't grow anything but cactus. It was too hot and dry. Other times it gets too cool, or it's too moist. Each plant kind of has its own requirements in a greenhouse environment. But so there's different techniques, but that's controlling environment. If you could, that's an environmental thing. Reducing the favorable environment can be an important step in control. Let's see. Don't have as much to do with nematodes around here because it's not as big a problem, but resistant varieties are a process, part of that. Keeping things sanitized, rotating crops, that's a fundamental thing for soybean production. If you get soybean cysts, you have to rotate with corn or other types of non-hosts. And solarization can happen, but some folks will do this thing called fallowing. It's an old practice, letting certain fields just kind of go out of production for a season to let them kind of reduce some of the pest and disease problems. It means that you have a valuable part of land that's not going to be used, but it's an old technique that can happen. And they talk about marigolds, but you really want to get super duper marigolds that will have lots and lots of, like typical marigolds may not be as effective at controlling it, but generally there's a certain varieties of African marigold that really produce very effective soil chemical allelopathy to keep them out. And I don't know, they talk about compost and green manure, but nematodes are not as big of a concern that we have around here. So that's as much kind of actual types of controls. I'm giving you kind of generalities of different types of controls, but the fact that we've got multiple techniques, and if we can utilize some of those multiple techniques, go back up to here. If we can use multiple of these techniques, we can reduce some of the disease problems. Making sure we've got good, healthy, strong plants. It's setting up a condition where we're going to reduce some of the problems. The other thing is what happens when you get it, when you get that disease. What do you do? And there's a series of techniques that can be used for that, but keep in mind it's not going to be foolproof. One of the very first most important things to be able to identify this is what kind of plant is it. If it's a grass species, it's not going to have something that's typically a broadleaf, a pest. Or if it's from one family of plants, there's some that aren't going to get a certain type of disease. You can eliminate process of elimination by knowing what your plant is. Then what are the symptoms? Symptoms are, what does that plant do in response to this infection? Symptoms and signs, you actually see signs, you can see the actual organism. And what was the pattern in the field? How was it distributed and planted? Is the site a low wet spot? If it's got something like that, there are environmental conditions that can help narrow down what it might be. When was it planted? What chemicals were used? What weather conditions? A series of things that are part of that. And so, at least if you're going to get plant diagnoses done, there's a type of sheet you can get to get some of that. And they have you answer some questions like this to at least get a start with it. First off, again, identifying the plant, critically important, knowing what you've got. So if it's a cherry tree, then the problem you're looking for is not cedar apple rust. So you've got to know your host. And then what are the common types of problems for that type of plant? So many times it's going to be a series of things. Carla gets calls all the time, and many times there's a lot of repeats, right? You're like, what do you see a lot of? It's typically
Depends on the part of the year.
Yeah, so also the season is an important, that can help with it. And so there's that. Also checking for mites and scale insects. If you can get a hand lens, that's a very useful tool. Because sometimes it looks like a disease, but it's really these little mites that are scarifying that surface, feeding on, drinking parts of that plant juice. And that's what's actually happening rather than disease. Scale insects are a problem, and many times you can see them, but it's basically an insect sucking the juice out of it. That sort of thing. So a hand lens is definitely a very useful tool, or a loop that gets you to look up close at it. You can see mites, under a loop. You can see certain very small types of insects with that, and that's a whole other type of control. There's a whole number of websites and apps that are available for plant disease diagnosis. What sort of things might be there? A lot of books and compendia and other things like that. Much of that stuff has been put online. And then if you're looking at the patterns of the symptom, is it uniformly distributed throughout the field, or is it spotty, different places? If it's uniform through most of the plants, it's probably not a soil-borne problem. If you got wet spot and there's a bunch of dead plants there, or dying plants there, that may be a place where you've got a root rot or something like that. There's ways to identify, in the landscape. Scatter or localize, series of those things. Is it a localized? It could be a soil-borne issue. Then you might have to consider draining that area, getting water to move off of that area so it's not, holding in that area. You can also do the soil. Did you all do soil? And they talk about the percolation test. Okay, yeah. So perk test will tell you how fast that water is going to move out of that area. That's useful for septic fields, and also where you're going to put certain plants and not put certain plants. Is this coming from runout? There's a lot of different water sources. And then if it's an irrigated field, what are the irrigation practices? In that situation, how often is that the case? Is the system on a timer, things like that? Is it a sprinkler or a drip? Drip irrigation is good because you have just the amount of water where it's needed, whereas sprinkler puts a lot of water that can spread fungal and other spores and things like that. And then, other cultural practices, the planting times, chemicals, fertilization practices, soil pH. Doing a soil test is fundamental for a lot of this stuff too, to know what the nutrient levels are like. And, weather conditions. There's a series of things that can help us in the diagnosis of what the disease might have been. Most of the diagnoses are made by matching all that information with the symptoms, even at the lab. So a lot of this stuff can be answered by where this stuff has occurred. And it can at least reduce and eliminate, certain things that it's not going to be. There are ways to do this process of digital diagnosis, but at this stage, we used to be able to send it right down to the Nashville lab, but what's our process now with that? Okay.
They changed to a new system called the ET clinic.
Okay.
We've been having some problems.
Okay.
So, usually if I just pick out an individual specialist. Probably have a problem.
I see. Yeah,
A lot of things have changed.
yeah. When Alan and Steve put this up, they were down there doing they were diagnosticians. They were working through that process. And you could send specimens, they could plate them out. And typically you go through that process of having an infected tissue, putting it on a certain type of culture media plate and sporulating, seeing how that works.
Yeah, we can still do that. Still sample it would be $15 card.
I see. Okay, so they're still in the process of that. I'm hoping that gets because I heard there was a major new investment in it coming into extension. I hear that. Hopefully they can get that.
Yeah, but I would think.
I see. So as far as stuff goes for your master gardeners here, if they've got a disease problem, is that something they can send an image to you about?
Yes. And sometimes that's the best way to catch. Sometimes they do office very often. I mean, they really work. But then I check the emails and I look at the picture, and I compare with the things online, have the pictures that I have. And then if I'm not sure, then I'll.
And so, yeah, this is, you have a great expertise in this county. I just want to tell you that. She really knows this stuff very well. Yeah.
Big trees, little trees, things like that. And if you go into row crop, you know, it's gonna be totally.
Yeah.
Traditional. Like, gate. Or I use
Which is in this place that's rapidly urbanizing is becoming, more abundant in that regards. Our typical row crop agriculture is not as much here. It's perhaps more up in the Pennyroyal region.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. So anyway, all right. So I have oversaturated you, and I apologize. This is what they gave me to do with this. But what kind of questions do you all have about some of this? Or if I completely overwhelmed you, I think I probably. Well, many times that's going to be pruning that's those spots out. Yeah. Mhm. Oh, shoot. Okay. So this is occurring in that area in particular. Probably there's going to be enough moisture for that bacteria to grow in that area. It's not like it's so much you're going to be able to spray with this leaf shot whole
slant. Laurel.
laurels.
Oh, now. Looks more like the picture, yeah.
Okay, let's see. Might take me a while to find that one.
I mean, we have a lot of problems with growing mountain laurel here. Yeah.
This is a ship laurel.
Oh, that's, yeah,
It's similar to that. Oh, yeah. And it's not that bad. It's more like a little leaf.
Okay.
yeah. A lot of times there's a mistake for insect damage, it's not. You can see kind of purple, purplish color, reddish around the hole that indicates there's a bacteria on there. Cultural controls, go water over the top, you have an irrigation. But to where it's not spraying up an open plant, like roots of the. And then there are, like topical cake spray. Hard to control.
Yeah.
Hard to control. We had these out here. I was really glad. Poland was
So go ahead.
They were looking horrible, so it gave us a reason to redo landscape. And so sometimes when you come out here in the daytime, you need to look at the landscape out front. We've got a lot of new arborvitae, grasses.
Who else? All right, well. Yeah, I'm sure everybody is worn out. Yeah, well, I really appreciate you bearing with me through all of this stuff. If you have any questions for me, that's again my email, contact info, and if you have any questions about folks that want to do an agriculture degree, we have a couple of different concentrations that might be of interest. One's called agri-science, which deals with various aspects of agriculture, including the plant side, soil side, as well as some of the livestock side. But folks specialize in certain areas. So I've got some that are really focused on the plant side and some on the soil side as well. Sustainable development is another one of our concentrations. So if you know anybody interested in that, they can contact me and we can touch base with them on those things. And so we'll probably do some of those Govs preview days in the spring and things like that for students. And let's see. Yeah, that's the main part of it. So, thank you all.
Yeah, there's gonna have to teach for us.
Oh, yeah.
We'll be contacting you next year.
Okay. Yeah.
We can do some tourist campus or something.
Oh, yeah.
West. of the-
Yeah, West is great.
West
We have a great resource on Austin Peay's campus. Wes Powell got his master's, one of my colleagues, Dr. Klingeman at UT, and knows all this stuff about native plants. He basically helped get us the Tree Campus USA designation. And he tries to replant some more invasives with natives. He's like his whole process. is pretty much-
Oh, yeah, he's on top of the emerald ash borer. I mean, we haven't confirmed it in Montgomery County, but I don't, it's gotta be here.
Yeah,
It's gotta be here, we just haven't caught it. But, he started treating the trees preventative. The trees that he wanted to save, the ash trees that were really large.
yeah, we have
In
a
good
series,
shape.
we have a whole, in the AP bowl on campus, there's all these ash trees lining them. So he treated those with the soil treatment, and it's a systemic to keep the insects out.
And then they have the Eastland Grasslands Council.
Oh, yeah, we have the Southeastern Grasslands Institute. And that's a whole thing about the fact that there are also grasslands in the Southeast that are natural and native and highly diverse. And so a lot of different places can support grassland vegetation that is many times as important for native species of animals and things like that too.
Right, because if you think about it, I mean, fescue is not native. And y'all know, I've told you, I'm not a grass person. I'd rather plant more trees or local, native grasses and things like that. And so Austin Peay in the spring has a native plant sale, and are they doing the tree sale now? I haven't gotten word.
The trees, I think that order is already happening,
Oh,
but I think the distribution happens sometime like in late February, March, something like that, where they plant them.
Oh, okay, yeah, but I thought that Wes had some native trees they were selling.
Oh, I think they may have had some.
They've already had it. Okay.
I think that's already happened.
Okay.
Usually his plant sales in spring,
Yeah.
plant sales in spring, but
Yeah, you do an online order and then you go and pick it up. And we have been distribution sites for the Tree Day USA or what.
Arbor Day.
Yeah, and Arbor Day. So, but we cooperate with Austin Peay a lot. We've had our meetings over there, the association meetings over there. We've had Laura Hunt come and talk, and she is hilarious and a very smart lady. And so we do a lot of interaction, I think with Austin Peay. I think that's grown in the last few years.
Oh, yeah, coming up, I think it's December. The first full weekend of December, let's see. There's this food summit that's gonna be there. There are gonna be folks from all over. So the 6th, 7th, and 8th, there's gonna be this food summit that's coming. They usually do it at other universities. It's the first time they're doing it here.
Yeah, first time we've had it here in Clarksville. So I'll send out information on that. I'm on the board.
Oh, good.
I keep on the planning committee. And so I need to get that information sent out to everyone. Several other things, but yeah, I mean, it'd be a good conference to attend. It'd be 3 days. They're gonna do tours on Sunday, a couple of our local parks. A lot of good lineup of speakers. All right, let's check and see if there's any questions here. I don't see anything on the chat. Does anybody on Zoom, out in Zoom land, have any questions? Nope. Okay, well, I'm gonna go ahead and close the meeting then. Those of you online, please remember to do your post test. That means class members. I see some certified master gardeners on there too. So 2024 class, get your post test into me, and you all go ahead and fill out yours and just leave them on the table there. And we'll definitely, hopefully see you Thursday night, but definitely keep the date in December 12th. Kind of mark that on your calendar to hold that date, because we'll have our big banquet in the evening, and that's always fun. So
What's the attire?
what's the what?
The business attire?
The attire, dress,
Yeah.
dress casual. Some people dress up fancy, some of us. I mean, you might even see me in a dress, you never know.
Okay.
Oh, I almost
I
forgot.
always use that as a joke.
This
you know,
is
or a
the
dress.
end of the season. I want to say, I'm very impressed with what the master gardeners are able to do. And one thing that I gotta say is, you all are actually eyes and ears for things that might happen. So if you see insect